Kenya's debt servicing costs, which are expected to surge by 22% this fiscal year, are set to rise even further as the Kenyan shilling sank to all-time lows of 112 Kenyan shillings against the US dollar when the forex markets opened recently. Domestic debt has also risen significantly as the government increased its borrowing requirements from the money market from 3.2 trillion in June 2020 to 3.7 trillion Kenyan shillings in June of 2021. External debt increased sharply from 3.1 trillion in June of 2020 to 4 trillion at the end of June 2021. In March of this year, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, assessed Kenya's public and publicly guaranteed debt as sustainable, but with a high risk of debt distress. The shilling's fall against the dollar comes as Kenya's National Treasury announced plans to merge several state agencies and departments in order to reduce costs. This could be in response to a review of Kenya's 3-year financial package from the IMF. The international bilateral lender said that Kenya must maintain momentum on its structural reform agenda. So today, we're focusing on what structural reforms Kenya is making and what the outcome of those reforms will be. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Joining me from Nairobi, Kenya is Aly Khan Satchu, Africa Geoeconomist and Macro Analyst, also the CEO of Rich Management and a friend of Business Edge. Ali, welcome once again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into the structural reforms, because there's a lot to talk about there, I want to talk about the rising debt profile and some of the issues associated with that. So we've seen that Kenya's debt profile has been front and center this past year, particularly in the wake of COVID. And according to a presentation made to the Senate Committee on Budget and Finance by the central bank in September, the country's total public debt to GDP ratio has risen significantly from a low of 40% in June 2012 to 69% in June of 2021. So again, what is Kenya going into debt for?
That's a very interesting question. And I would also have doubts about the debt to GDP ratio because the economy has been shown to be growing even in the toughest of tough times. And I think that overall GDP numbers probably a little bit inflated. So debt to GDP is much higher than that's currently being reported. The biggest loan that was taken was for the railway. This was the SGR, standard gauge railway, that was built from Mombasa to Nairobi and was meant to connect all the way to the DR Congo. The raison d'etre of that railway was that it would interconnect multiple countries to the port of Mombasa. Unfortunately, the railway stalled in Naivasha, which is about 100 kilometers from Mombasa, and has not been doing what it said it would on the label. So there is no return on that particular investment, enormous loan in the billions of dollars. And, you know, there's been a sequence of borrowing, which has been, I think, misspent. This is a symptom of a disease that we've seen in many parts of the continent. So, yes, you're quite correct. Enormous debt load, country at high risk of distress, frankly. I think the IMF were playing politics, when they made the more gentle comment. And now servicing these loans is a very big challenge because approximately it's estimated 60% of government revenues are going into servicing loans, which is a very poor place to find yourself in.
And very true. So this is East Africa's largest economy, one of the largest economies on the continent. But as you said, it was earlier this year that the IMF said that the debt was sustainable, but with a high risk of debt distress. Now, you said possibly they were being politically kind in their statement. So give us your assessment, your true assessment as to the level of distress or the position that Kenya may be in because of its debt loan profile right now.
So I think, fundamentally the loan profile is not sustainable. And the question is, what will be done to restructure those loans? And at some point that's got to be done. I mean, it's probably 12 to 18 months away, but it's simply not sustainable as I see it at the moment. The reason I think the IMF were politically kind is that we're living in a very rough neighborhood. You can see what's happening to the north of us in Ethiopia, where there's a big risk of implosion. Sudan, even further north, has got challenges. Somalia. So I think the IMF and the World Bank have made a geoeconomic, geopolitical decision to support Kenya through these tough times. And therefore, you've seen loans coming from them at much, much lower rates, which is allowing some breathing space for the Kenya government because of the lower interest payments. But the substantive concern is that, we've got a serious challenge here. The government's going some distance to try and resolve it, but it's got to go a lot further.
All right, so let's talk about the distance that the Kenyan government is going, and that involves the issue of structural reforms. Now, Kenya has struggled to put into play the promises it has made regarding that for a number of years, and many African countries will remember the structural adjustment programs of the 1990s. Then you also had the midterm policy framework, which served as the basis for IMF discussions in Kenya between 2000 and 2003, and their priority areas included public service reform and rearranging government spending. We're looking at 20 years down the road, and Kenya is still having conversations and still having structural reform being used as a condition for getting loans from the IMF and the World Bank. Why has it been so difficult for Kenya in particular to make those necessary adjustments and reforms to its structure, to the civil service, to state-owned enterprises, as we get more into this conversation?
So you took us back to the 80s, the structural adjustment programs in the 80s and 90s, and of course the IMF was a very dirty word in those days because they did all the tough things that governments weren't prepared to do. Then you went forward to 2002, 2003. That period of 2002 to about 2012 was a golden age for Kenya's economy. The parastatals were reformed. We had a privatization program. The government remained within a reasonable spending envelope. Tax collections increased. And really, people look back at that period as one where the country was very conservatively managed and well managed. And then we're looking at this period of the last two terms that we've encountered going back from 2012, when there has been massive borrowing under the banner of infrastructure spending. And this is, and I think obviously the biggest piece of that was the railway. Unfortunately, the railway did not do what it was meant to do. So that's part of the big problem. In terms of parastatals, I think a lot of tough decisions. The can was kicked down the road and then kicked again. And now, it can't be kicked any further. So we've come to that moment in time when either the government does what it needs to do, or it uses the likes of the IMF and the World Bank as cover to do the things that it needs to do. And I think that's what we're watching now, really. The IMF is in the box seat, and they're the ones driving this agenda of reform in the parastatal sector and in other areas.
What options do you think Kenya really has? As you said, there's going to have to be some kind of conversation about the restructuring of the loans that are available right now. It may not be now, it may be a year or two from now, but Kenya is really quite short of options in terms of the debt market in order to finance the spending. COVID-19 has hit government revenues very hard. We also saw that the Kenya Revenue Authority mixed tax collection targets by over $600 million in the first 4 months of the current financial year. And then we'll get into the state corporations. But what other options are available really for Kenya to make it through these tough times?
So it's like any business. I mean, you've really got to take a knife to costs. That's where you start. And that's politically quite untenable for many governments. But, you've got to look at your cost base and you've got to start reducing that. For example, the recurrent expenditure component of government spending, which is salaries and allowances, is way too high. And, they're starting to make an effort in some ways. You've got to also look at the cost of government. We had devolved government, we've got multiple, we've got a parliament, we've got senators. This is a very, very expensive millstone around the Kenyan taxpayer. So those, I think politically are very difficult decisions to make, and I'm not sure they're going to get made because we're in the run up to an election, and in that, we're in the political season. So in terms of raising debt, obviously, the Eurobond market is always open at a price. Kenya said yesterday they were looking at issuing a Eurobond of about $1 billion. The domestic debt market has been tapped ad infinitum. The Kenya government is paying very high rates of interest to attract money into the domestic side. And it's been successful in terms of borrowing that money, but that's expensive, long-term money at 11 and 12% interest rates, which is very high. So I think the options are gradually running out. There isn't as much elasticity in those options as there were before. And I think, the government has to make some hard decisions, but so far I haven't seen them make them. You've seen some talk of reform in the parastatal sector, a lot of talk around power, the cost of power inputs from independent power producers, which is just so egregious and long overdue a reform. Cabinet Secretary Monica Juma is well thought of and has started engaging with those folks. But there are multiple areas where the government has really got to get serious. In terms of tax collection, which you mentioned, which was suppressed during COVID, it's recovered very strongly. The challenge is that, you can only squeeze so much before the pips start to squeak. And I think we're reaching that point where the pips are squeaking because, the tax collection is just about taking everything off the table.
All right, Ali, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll get more into those reforms. We've heard that as it is right now, there are some parastatals that are only servicing 10 people per month, but they're still getting money. They're still getting money from the government. Let's talk about that and how Kenya can reform the parastatals. More on that when we come back. More than half of Kenya's 247 parastatals have either registered a deficit or a loss in the last financial year ended June. A Treasury report has shown this. When we come back from the break, we look at government's ministries, departments, and agencies. Stay with us. And still with me from Nairobi, Kenya is Aly Khan Satchu, and we're looking at Kenya's structural reforms. Now, towards the end of 2020, Kenya's Treasury Cabinet Secretary Ukur Yatani said there are parastatals that continue to incur huge administrative costs, such as paying leases and employees, despite serving about 10 people a month. There has been some progress made in assessing the financial situations of state-owned enterprises that pose the largest fiscal risk. Now, Ali, paint us a picture in terms of some of the issues that we're seeing with state-owned enterprises in Kenya. What are the financial challenges? What are the issues that have made them, unfortunately, loss-making or draining enterprises on the government?
There are about total, in my estimation, of between 900 and 1,000 parastatals under the auspices of the government of Kenya. And like you said, some of those have got just one person and they're serving hardly any people. So I think there has to be some rationalization of these parastatals. Then, of course, you have the much bigger ones, the likes of Kenya Power, Kengen, Kenya Airways falls under that, and these have not been, for the most part, with the exception of Kengen and maybe Kenya Pipeline. The majority of them are in debt, heavily in debt. relying on the generosity of the Treasury to bail them out year in, year out. And I think, the challenge has been that, like in many African countries, quite often, you stuff the parastatal with your fellows. You're not really running it as professionally as you should be. It's seen as a political gift in the hand of the administration of the time. And, really, you can continue down this route for so long, but then eventually, you hit the end of the road. And I think there is an increasing realization amongst the authorities that we've hit the end of the road in a number of scenarios. And that's why you're hearing this kind of talk coming out of the Treasury and a desire now to start to fix it. But it's an enormous job. And what I would be doing would be rationalizing them, making the ones that are effective candidates for privatization, get government out of business, get it into the private sector, and you create a virtuous circle that way. And I saw it happen under Mrs. Thatcher and under President Kibaki here in Kenya. And I'm surprised that particular policy just found no traction in the last 8-9 years.
And it's interesting you talk about getting government out of business. One of the places that they've also looked at is the government-owned sugar mills. Now, the Kenya government is looking at privatizing those, and there's been a lot of legal challenges and delays, but now they're moving to leasing the factories to private investors. We've also seen several mergers. The Industrial and Commercial Development Corporation, Industrial Development Bank, and Tourism Finance Corporation will now be merged to create the Kenya Development Corporation. Then you have the merger of the Kenya Export Promotion and Branding Agency with Ken Invest and KTB, as well as Kenya Yearbook, to form the Promotion Kenya Agency, and that seems to be at an advanced stage. Then there's also reforms to the Kenya Post Office Savings Bank and the Postal Corporation of Kenya. When we have these conversations, as it was with the structural adjustment programs under the IMF and the World Bank, we have to also understand that there's going to come job losses and unemployment. There are no figures as of yet. The Treasury Secretary, even though he has said this is going to happen, has been very reluctant to put a figure to possible job losses or even agree that job losses will happen. But what do you think is going to be the intended, or rather the consequences of these actions if it moves from talk to full action and we do end up with some unemployment, especially given the situation of things for many Kenyans right now?
That's a very interesting question, and the examples you gave were coming from very different segments. Look, if you've got a stuttering parastatal which is in a coma, you're not creating that many jobs. And if you restructure your economy and you position it for growth, and you make these companies no longer zombie companies, but companies that are delivering what they're meant to do, then you'll create more jobs. But yes, in the near term, there's definitely some layoffs that have to happen. But ultimately, you're positioning your economy in these companies for growth in the future. You gave a number of examples. Sugar, for example, is a very interesting industry. Kenya imports a lot of sugar. Just before an election, everyone gets a license, and a lot of these sugar barons finance political campaigns. So you're dealing with multiple issues when you go into that area. The Kenya Postal Service was trying to reinvent itself as a delivery channel a la Amazon. I'm not sure what exactly has happened with that. So I think there are opportunities to restructure. There will be a short-term pain, but there will be a long-term gain.
So let me ask about what happened in 2020. So the World Bank advised the government to cut wasteful spending and increase its efficiency. And this was part of conditions for Kenya to access $2.244 billion in loans for budgetary support for the IMF. And even though we know that there was serious pushback from Kenyans, what's the status of that? We know that there have been talks now that just also wrapped up in early November as well with the World Bank in terms of moving forward with another series of loans. What's the status on these conversations with the IMF and the World Bank?
That's an interesting question. I mean, the IMF, the World Bank always set very sensible propositions, but sometimes these propositions are soft pedaled by the government who don't want to make those hard decisions. And Kenya has a bit of a reputation of being quite clever at that. I think, the pressure will continue to build to implement these reforms. I don't think they've been implemented meaningfully yet. We haven't seen that. And now it's going to be very difficult with less than 12 months to an election to implement those reforms. I think the IMF and the World Bank, both of them, give a little bit of room for Kenya, but they're going to continue to turn the screw. I think the screw will be turned in areas like, the fuel price with VAT, a tax collection, but also, these guys are not just sitting in Washington, they are deeply embedded now, even in the Treasury.
All right. And finally, while we said that the structural adjustment program, SAP, IMF, World Bank were really bad words in the 80s and the 90s, those conversations are happening again. Why do you think there's still a push from the IMF, from the World Bank, for so much structural reform to happen in African economies? It's not just this conversation in Kenya. We're seeing it with Sudan. We're seeing that push from these multilateral agencies that African economies need to make these adjustments, bring down government spending, reduce the overall workforce, particularly for the civil service, take away the subsidies in maybe food and grains and bread and fuel. Why this push from these agencies?
So I think, if you look back at the longer sweep of history, you talked about those structural adjustment programs in the 80s and 90s. Then we had a golden period after the debt write-off and through 2000 to about 2008, the financial crash, where really our debt load had been taken off. We looked in much sounder financial condition. During that period, we saw growth pick up. And I think after that period, if I look back at the last 10 years, and I think across the continent, we overborrowed, we did not spend what we borrowed wisely, we blew a lot of that cash. And now we're in quite a tricky situation, not just Kenya, it's pretty much across the continent. Extreme examples are Zambia, for example. So what's happened is we've now had to go back to these multilateral institutions and say, look, we didn't do such a great job. We've overborrowed. We need some help. And these guys are coming in and saying, sure, we'll help you, but this is what we think you need to do. And really, we need to do what they're telling us to do. We've left it too long. We've allowed our governments to grow too fat at the expense of the African citizen. And we really need to make these reforms. Those countries that make these reforms are going to come out the other side looking really, really good. And I would put my money on somewhere like Zambia. I like what he's saying. And I think he's determined to do what needs to be done. But, we're now in a very testing period. And those countries that have smart and ahead of the curve policymakers are going to outperform those countries that don't. And it's not difficult to see where the outperformers are going to come from and where the underperformers are going to come from. Countries like Sudan, about which I was so excited. You can imagine if you're going to have a military situation there, it's just not going to get going. They're going to recede from reforms. Here in Kenya, we're in a fortunate position geoeconomically with the support of lots of partners. And one hopes we take the hard decisions, swallow the bitter pill, and come out on the other side.
All right, Aly Khan, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time, as always.
Thank you.
All right. A bitter pill that Kenya and many African countries need to swallow is structural reform. Kenya is getting to work, but will the talk turn to genuine action that gives genuine, long-lasting results? Only time will tell, and we'll be watching. The other thing we're keeping our eyes on to watch is NC4 to watch. Stay tuned. And these are the stories we're keeping our eyes on now, despite inflation for October being pretty much in line with expectations and stabilizing at 5%. Fuel inflation on the back of a sharp increase in crude oil prices and a significantly weaker rand will be the biggest risk factor when South Africa's Reserve Bank decides on whether to hike or hold its repo rate at 3.5% today. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has estimated that developing nations such as South Africa will require in the range of $4 trillion to achieve the transition to low-carbon energy over the next 15 years. In a report titled COVID-19 in Nigeria, Frontline Data and Pathways for Policy, the World Bank says the general increase in food prices, which occurred between June 2020 and June 2021, may have increased the percentage of Nigerians living below the national poverty line from 40.1% to 42.8%. And finally, Kenya will pay the lion's share in financing of the East African Community budget that will now be based on the size of a country's economy. The EAC Sectoral Council on Finance and Economic Affairs has agreed on a hybrid model of financing that will see countries pay an equal amount of 65% of the budget, while the remaining 35% will be based on a country's GDP. And that's Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you tomorrow, 11 a.m. West African time. Let's talk business, the economy, and financial news coming from here on the continent. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun. Have a pleasant day.